welcome to the lunch seminar series. My name is Arvind Narayanan. I'm the faculty director of CITP, and the goal of the series mainly is to hear from folks internally across Princeton so that we can learn what we're all working on, and of course the visitors really, so that we can create connections across campus and deepen CITP's role as a kind of hub for work on technology and society, tech policy across the whole university. And we have a little bit of a tradition of kicking this off with the faculty director sharing what they've been thinking about, what's been on their minds. So I'm going to present to you this paper today that's very much a work in progress, and I think that works great. There's lots of folks I would love to hear from you. I won't go on for too long. The first author is Akash Kapur, and since it's easy to miss, I want to clarify that this is different from my usual co-author, Sayash Kapur, and no relation. And as part of a broader project with Akash and Karthik Shastri as well. It's part of an effort by the Chadha Center for Global India, looking at AI as digital public infrastructure, especially in developing country environments. But this one doesn't have specifically a developing country focus, although I'll have one brief point to make about that. So as you can see here, this question is about whether AI can get worse. And immediately that's kind of a narrative violation. We've been told over and over that today's AI is the worst that it's ever going to be, and it's going to quickly keep getting better. However, I think this is perhaps less unthinkable for many people than it was a month or two ago because of the release of GPT-5. When GPT-5 was released, I see many of you nodding and smiling. There was kind of an open revolt on Reddit, on the ChatGPT and other subreddits. Many people experienced this as a degradation in product quality, and they wanted OpenAI to bring ChatGPT 4.0 back. And in fact, the backlash was so powerful that OpenAI was forced to make changes, bring back some of the older models. And this was, I think, the top post that was up for quite a while. Just give you a second to read it. I don't know if the font is too small. Many of you have probably seen this. The specific contents don't matter much, but it's just capturing the level of frustration that many users, not everybody, but many users had with this new product. So what is going on here? So a lot of people think that OpenAI deliberately made the model worse. They were trying to save costs. Cost is one of the points that this person makes, and therefore they deliberately worsened the model's capabilities. I don't think that is what is going on. Even though this was the first kind of large-scale instance of people feeling that ChatGPT had gotten worse, something similar to this had happened more than 2 years ago, and we wrote an essay at that time analyzing it, and you can look it up. But the key point there, though, is that capability is not the same as behavior. The capability of the underlying model is only one factor, and not even necessarily the main factor, in determining how users are going to perceive the usefulness of a product. And that has at least as much to do with the behavior of the model. And these are two largely orthogonal things. And so this distinction between models and products is a critical one that I want us to keep in mind throughout today's discussion. And it's something we've written over and over about. The product aspects that matter to a lot of people include things like reliability. If you have, for instance, a shopping agent which occasionally orders your items to the wrong address, which are the kinds of things that actually go wrong. So it might be the case that capabilities-wise, GPT-5 is no worse, but nonetheless, it's experienced by many users as a degradation. And that's not necessarily a contradiction at all. And these are two different levels of analysis. So I wanted to start with that point. And I just have some notes here, so I'm pulling this up. And the goal is to think about what might happen in the future. But before we can get there, I want to set the stage for 5 minutes just talking about, excuse me, potential degradation in products in the economy generally, and then specifically digital products, the previous generation of products, platforms such as social media, which is where Cory Doctorow's work on enshittification comes in. It's a term that Akash and I have borrowed here, and then move on to AI. So let me take a few minutes to do that, and I'm going to take an economic lens. I know we have economists in the room. I apologize if I say something that's incorrect, but this is just to give a basic intuition, and it's not really an economics paper by any stretch of the imagination. So the first observation is that when firms have market power, it might be because they have a monopoly or an oligopoly, or there are high switching costs for some reason. The firms have the ability to set prices. They might obviously jack up prices almost definitionally, but that's not the only thing they might do. They might also, in some cases, degrade product quality, perhaps as a way of saving costs, and they might often choose to do that because that's less transparent and legible to consumers and regulators compared to, monopolists simply squeezing people by raising prices. And this happens a lot. Here are a couple of examples. I mean, whether it's a food manufacturer putting less stuff in a can, or airlines creating less legroom so that you can have more seats, those are all examples of degradation that we're familiar with in many other domains. Although the airline one, that might not be a consequence of market power. Perhaps it's because of too much price competition. I don't know. But the point is, this is a general phenomenon. However, when it comes to digital products, it's taken to a whole nother level. And it's important to talk a little bit about what the differences are. So with digital platforms, typically when you're talking about free products, such as social media, increasing the price is not even an option, right? So if a firm does want to exercise market power, if it does want more revenue out of each user, it's not going to do it by increasing the price. But because of the nature of digital platforms, in ways that will become clear, firms end up having a much greater latitude to play around with other aspects of the product experience. And I think that's kind of setting the stage for where Doctorow's work comes in. He's been writing essays about this for a long time, has a book coming out next month as well. I'm going to give you a very, very brief 3-minute preview of the model that he introduced, which makes a lot of sense to us, and which is kind of the starting point for thinking about AI. So he's talking about, platforms like social media or search or Amazon or the iPhone. These are all two-sided marketplaces. There's users on the one side who are consuming posts or buying things or whatever, and then on the other side there's sellers or advertisers or producers of apps on the App Store or something like that. And so what he says is initially these apps tend to be VC funded. There's a lot of VC money flowing in, and what these platforms are going to do is allocate that surplus to the users in order to bring in users. Initially create a really good user experience, and that might be in the form of free shipping or an ad-free experience or something like that. Once they get a lot of users, once they're able to achieve certain amount of lock-in, it's hard for users to switch from one social network to another, let's say. Then platforms start to claw back that surplus from users and allocate it to the business customers that they have, the advertisers or the vendors on Amazon or whoever it might be. And eventually, once they have a kind of monopoly or some version of that over both sides of this market, then they squeeze the business customers as well, and they extract all of the surplus and basically, return it to investors or something like that. And this is what leads to a degradation in product quality. And he uses this to explain over and over with many examples why many of these products are at least perceived as having gotten significantly worse over the decades. Maybe they're oversaturated with ads, or maybe they're experienced as very addicting, or Amazon is able to do all the things that Amazon does, basically. And so the question for us is, can something like this happen with AI? There are many similarities and differences. We don't model AI, these general purpose AI platforms like ChatGPT, we don't model them as two-sided. You could model them as two-sided, where the other side is the deals they have to make increasingly because of data, training data being no longer free, the deals they have to make in order to acquire training data. But those seem like very transactions that happen at different points in the development and deployment of the system. It doesn't make sense to model it, in our view, as a two-sided platform, so we're leaving that out of the model. We're just talking about the relationship between AI companies and their consumers. So there are some differences, but there are, we think, also clear similarities, which I will get to. And I think the reason all of this matters, one obvious reason why it matters is if it turns out that anti-competitive behavior is happening in a different way than regulators are used to. It's not simply jacking up prices, it's all these other things. Then yes, regulators need to get wise to these new shady tricks that companies can pull. But there is something much bigger at stake, which is that in the process of locking in users and extracting revenue out of them, the negative externalities that this creates, whether it's the complaints about social media and polarization or mental health issues in teen users and so forth, those in a way seem to be much bigger than the mere competition issues that seem to be at stake. And we can imagine with AI's potential for personalization, how much more powerful the addictive behaviors can be compared to social media, and arguably we're already starting to see early signs of that. And so it's important, we think, to anticipate Enshittification in AI before it starts happening on a large scale. We don't think it's happening quite yet, at least at anywhere near the scale that it's happened with social media. And it's important to think about what are the levers for change. Now, I'll make one clarification of what the scope of our analysis is, and then I want to pause to see if folks want to bring up anything for discussion. You can ask clarifying questions at any time, but I'll also stop at a few points so that we can have a brief discussion before moving forward. So there have been so many actual and potential harms that have been discussed in the context of AI, environmental harms, job displacement, deepfakes. Those are all important, but they're out of scope for us. We're merely talking about the consumer experience of these general purpose AI products, such as chatbots, and what are things that might cause that experience to degrade or be perceived as a degradation. That is what we want to anticipate and try to avoid. Awesome. Yes?
Is part of the scope of your work considering like AI embedded within applications like we see Copilot in Microsoft or Google and Gemini, or is it more on this sort of by itself side?
Thank you. The latter, and that's going to be literally the next bullet on my next slide.
I'll expect a check in the mail.
Other thoughts, questions, comments? Yeah.
I guess an argument that somebody who's very pro-market could make against the idea of enshittification is that it's great. It's a way for products to come and like die eventually and then be replaced by new ones. So if ChatGPT gets crappier, I saw one of the comments by the user on Reddit saying, "Oh, Claude is better," and so then Claude will get enshittified, and then it will be a new one. So it's like So AI as a whole could be getting better, even if companies are getting worse or products are getting worse.
Yeah, definitely. So today the situation is highly competitive. So if ChatGPT feels degraded to users now, it's not a competition issue. So that's why this is about the future, where firms might have market power or some other way in which degradation is a much more sticky problem and is not easily solved by competition. And I'll explain what those are.
Different from the Cory's model, like I guess, like how would you see network effects in some of these applications, right? Because part of the reason why they managed to kind of like decrease the quality of the service is because you are locked in.
Yeah.
But would you think that people would be locked into ChatGPT, or how would they be locked in?
That's coming. Okay, so let me proceed with the slides, because I think the answers to a lot of these are coming, or tentative answers at least. So there's two, we think, basic preconditions before for any of this to really happen. One is that general purpose AI should continue to exist as a product category, and that seems silly to even say. How could that not exist? But actually, the vision of technologists developing this early on, at least, was not that this was a product category. It goes to your question. The idea was that these web interfaces for ChatGPT and whatever are merely demos for the underlying capabilities, and then those capabilities would be integrated into all the other applications you're using. If that's what happens, this analysis is not that meaningful. There can still be concerns, but you have to look at those other different product categories. But that's not the way things have been going, and the companies have actually reluctantly adapted to this. When ChatGPT was released, they called it a research preview. They didn't intend for it to be a product. They intended it only to showcase the capabilities to researchers and developers who can then take the underlying API and adopt it into their own applications. But for whatever reason, it's proven to be very sticky as a product category, and now they're developing these agents that are supposed to go off and do all kinds of things for you. So presumably, this way of commercializing these capabilities will continue. And the other basic precondition is that this is kind of in contrast to the superintelligence worldview. And that worldview will say, none of this stuff really matters. We're just a couple of years away from these things becoming so superhumanly capable that whatever companies might do on the margins to change their behavior a little bit is not going to matter. It's going to take over all of the jobs in the economy and whatnot. So if that's the scale at which we're going to have impacts, then yes, of course, this analysis is too marginal to be relevant. That's not what we're predicting is going to happen. And we're, again, going back to this divergence between model capabilities and product usefulness. Those two are already diverging so strongly. A lot of the AI boosters are offended that people are thinking of GPT-5 as getting worse for them, and they keep pointing out, oh, look at all these math benchmarks. You know, it's stronger than a PhD and whatnot. But to the vast majority of users, it doesn't matter if the capabilities at software engineering or math or whatever is better than a PhD. It still can't, you know, go buy a simple product for you, right? So the usefulness of these products, chatbots, agents as a product, is getting divorced from the change in underlying capabilities. So those are two basic preconditions. To analyze further, we have to look at two different routes through which enshittification might happen. And the first one, this is similar to social media, to Doctorow's analysis. Firms in the future, again, not today, very competitive today, but in the future, they might have market power, and I'll explain why. And they realize that degrading their products is a way to either cut costs or make more revenue, and they realize they can get away with it, and so they choose to do that. And the other is less of a market thing, and there are ways in which developers might be forced to degrade their products. So I'll get to what those might be. So let's start with the first one. So to reemphasize, this is not about today, this is about how today's competitive market might change in the future. So one thing that might happen is the personalization and companionship that we're already seeing a lot with chatbots might intensify greatly. You might come to see these, we might all come to see these as our friends or companions or whatever, and to switch from one to another is kind of like breaking up, right? And so that's a kind of switching cost that I don't think we're really used to thinking about. I don't know, in the way that regulators think about competition. And so how do you even quantify that kind of switching cost? There's a nice essay by Miranda Bogan, who's a CITP affiliate, that talks about how some of this is starting to happen because of the increasing amount of personalization and memory and so forth. Another version of that is what a kind of equivalent that might happen in business contexts. These tools are much more integrated with your enterprise software stack than they are today, and that introduces, again, a tremendous kind of switching cost because you know, it knows all your workflows, knows all your documents and so forth, and it's not so easy to transfer over all of that understanding to another model or another product. So data flywheels, this is the idea that so far chatbots have mostly been trained on text scraped from the internet, and that phase of training is over. Many people, many AI observers have been talking about this. Rich Sutton, and I forget who's the co-author, have an essay or a talk called The Age of Experience, I think is what they're calling it. In any case, yeah, we agree with that perspective. A lot of improvement in the future will have to come from training it on actual user interactions with these existing products, right? And if that were the case, a company that has a lead now in terms of users might be able to greatly amplify that because you get a flywheel going where your product is a little bit better, you get more users, you have more user interaction data to train on, and that further allows you to make your product better. We predicted a year ago that Anthropic, which at the time was the only holdout that was not training on user data, would eventually be forced to start doing so. And in fact, just last week, they changed their policy. So right now, all of the leading companies in this space are training on user data. So this is becoming an important component of how these products are going to improve in the future. And then finally, network effects, to Manuel's point, what network effects might arise here are, I think, a little bit tricky. Right now, I don't think there are any major kind of network effects, but one trend that's in motion is for all these developers to have partnerships with media companies for sources of data, not for training, but during inference time. So for instance, OpenAI has a partnership with, I think, I forget which one, but Amazon has a partnership with New York Times and so forth. And the idea is that, oh, there's an exclusive deal, so if you want your chatbot to be able to answer questions based on stories in the New York Times, this is the chatbot that you go to. Right? So that's a kind of network effect. Okay, so in addition to market power, a few things probably need to happen. One is, as long as the number of users are growing rapidly, companies will likely choose to increase their revenue simply through growth, because some fraction of this growth represents paying subscribers, as opposed to trying to squeeze more revenue from each user. In some work that we've done here with Mihir and others in the past, looking at the evolution of dark patterns being misleading user interfaces that trick users into giving their data or purchasing more than they might have intended. One of the things we observed is that dark patterns really became a thing with, shopping websites and social media and other platforms when they exhausted revenue growth through user growth and were forced to find ways of increasing revenue per user. And this is just a matter of time. The user numbers are rapidly growing, and within a couple of years, they will probably have reached their total addressable user base, and they will be forced to think about revenue per user to a much greater degree than they're doing today.
Quick question.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
You talked about feedback. If these companies start using their user data, is there a feedback effect going on there where the same data set is being regurgitated in some sense, and there's a homogenization of the outcome?
Yeah, that's a great question.
That could
Yeah,
probably
yeah. Let me make a note.
monopolization.
Yeah, that could probably say that last thing.
So that would, if one firm, for example, ChatGPT, begins to standardize the product in that sense, then would that cement its monopolization?
Yes, I think that is the concern I was expressing, although I wasn't framing it in terms of homogenization of
The outcome.
of the outcome. So I was, we were just thinking that firms that have a bigger market share would be able to improve their product quality more rapidly, and that could lead to a monopoly. But I think homogenization is a related and important concern, which we will think carefully about. Thank you. Other thoughts, questions, discussion? Okay, so one important difference between social media and these AI products today is that they do have a paid tier, and they're not primarily ad-based. That might change in the future, and that might be one escape valve that prevents at least the worst aspects of degradation that we have seen with other free products. When companies are looking for more revenue per user, they try to upsell them into the paid tier, or they increase increasingly pricier tiers. Now we're up to, I think, $2,000 a month for some tiers of some of these chatbots, at least the enterprise offerings. So who knows what the limit is there? Those are all things that might actually, it's an eye-popping number, but it might actually, to some extent, prevent degradation. But that's far from guaranteed. I think it remains the case that only about 2% of the users of these chatbots are even paying at all, and so most of their revenue will ultimately have to come from the free tier. And if that's going to be the case, we're going to repeat a lot of what we've seen with previous generations of products. And then Doctorow also analyzes other countervailing forces, potentially. There's a long case study of Google and how workers inside Google have long represented an organized force to try to push back against what they see as unethical deployments of technology. But he also talks about how that power has largely gone away in the last few years. There was a big difference, big turning point, I think, around the time of the firing of Timnit Kapur and Margaret Mitchell from Google, and that represented a shift in not just Google's attitude towards pushback on ethics from its workers, but across the industry as well. And today, I think when we look at AI companies, I would not really count on worker power as a way of resisting enshittification or product degradation, to the extent that workers inside some of these companies are organized about anything. It's some of the worries around superintelligence. And that seems like, to me, a very substantially different issue than what's at stake here. Okay, and in the paper, we go into this in some detail, but I'll be very brief about it here. So exactly what are we worried about? You know, things like increasing amounts of ads and upselling. Again, if you think about ways to make more revenues per user or decrease costs, increasing levels of sycophancy and addictive design to keep users using these products for longer, degradation of quality. So forget about improving the capabilities of the underlying models to even maintain the same level of quality as the world evolves, as data changes, as you need to retrain these models with more and more up-to-date data. There's a lot of work that companies have to put in. And meanwhile, just as search engines have to contend with SEO, search engine optimization, AI companies have to contend with, it's unclear what that's going to end up being called, but basically adversarial users polluting the information ecosystem so that they can get their preferred narratives into the outputs of AI chatbots. And propaganda organizations are already doing this, but commercially motivated actors might also start doing this en masse in the future, if they haven't already. I don't know, I haven't checked, but it takes a lot of resources inside companies to fight this constant battle against adversaries who are trying to pollute the websites for search engines or the training sources for AI chatbots. And companies might decide that it's not worth putting in that amount of investment in order to keep up the same level of quality of these products once they have market power. Okay, so I want to talk about the other route, or maybe I'll pause for a second for discussion before I switch to this.
I sort of had a question on the regulation point. You hinted to it earlier that it's something that could be an effect here, but we have already seen that regulation has been largely unsuccessful with modern tech companies, and I think this is one where it's even harder to understand what's going on. Do you have any ideas, or are you guys considering anything along those lines, what regulation might look like to prevent enshittification in AI?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. I'll have more to say on this later, but one thing we're thinking about is how some of the regulation that's being contemplated today might inadvertently contribute to enshittification. So that's one angle. I mean, in terms of what regulation might prevent enshittification, the most obvious answer is just for enforcers of competition policy to at least be aware that these are all things that might happen, that in the modern era, what market power looks like is not necessarily just raising prices, it's all of these other things. And then finally, we've been thinking about it, and this is very much a less developed part of the paper, what are ways in which policymakers in general might be able to exercise some kind of soft power to shift the direction of the industry so that it's not necessarily just framed as a matter of regulation and enforcement. Are there ways in which you can shift the industry towards paid models as opposed to ad-supported models? We don't know, but it's early enough in the AI space as opposed to social media that there might be opportunities for that kind of lighter touch approach.
Yeah, we're so early in the game now. We're in the first billion years of Big Bang or something in terms of this AI being a bang. In research on climate, we have the saying that somebody strikes a match in Tokyo and many years later on the other side of the planet, the weather is affected by that. So it seems like it makes it very hard for us to know what's going to evolve from all the things that are happening today.
Yeah, totally fair point, and that's very consistent with what we're trying to say. It is early in the game. We're not offering any definitive predictions, but I think it's important to know what might happen. What are some reasonable analogies with what has happened in the past with other kinds of products? And again, for now, our main goal is increasing awareness and measurement. I'll say this towards the end, but just to anticipate that a little bit, right now, when you compare the amount of energy that's being put into measurement of capabilities versus measurement of product quality, like, I mean, the latter is just not really happening in a systematic way. And I think closing that gap could be very impactful. Yeah, so this is not a call for any specific regulation at this moment in time. I just want to make that clear. Brad on Zoom has their hand up.
Hi there, thanks. Just on your previous slide, also the topic on the symptoms of degradation. How much of that also do you think is driven by which sort of investor group blinks first, which means less likely to fund the machine that much longer, which forces these behavior?
Yeah, if I understand the question correctly, is one of the things that's going to drive degradation the fact that at some point the VC money is going to dry up and these developers will face much stronger pressure to show returns on investment? Yes, absolutely. I mean, that was the implicit premise behind a lot of this, and I did mention that explicitly in the context of social media, but I should have made that clearer here. That is going to be an inflection point, we think. Agreed. Kincaid, and then
But rather, Collins has this concept of reverse evolution, where first people evolve to exploit their environments, and then the environments evolve to exploit their inhabitants. First we learn how to forage food on the grocery stores, learn to make food that's irresistible to us. I wonder if you think of this reverse evolution as the same or slightly different from gentrification. For example, sycophancy, where chatbots become more irresistible, addictive. Seems like the chatbots are evolving within the companies to exploit the users more, but not necessarily to make their experience worse, unless you separate the user psyche from their ego or something.
Yeah, totally fair point. So what exactly do we mean when we say degradation? I think we should be much clearer about that. I'll have a few comments on that actually, I think, coming right up, but in the paper we'll be sure to think more about that and also look up the reference for reverse evolution that we mentioned. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah, I was going to ask whether degradation is objective or subjective.
Yeah, it's more subjective than objective, and again, I'm about to address that a little bit at least. Thanks.
You were mentioning that employees at like these types of companies are having less and less power to make like organized movements like at Google. And this might have just been like a unique case for OpenAI, but when Sam Altman was fired and or like asked to be removed from the board, and like a gazillion employees, not a gazillion, like a couple hundred, were like were threatening to leave unless you bring him back, and that ended up doing something. Does that contradict that like organized movement thing, or was that just a special case?
Yeah, I mean, that drama was just so different from the kinds of issues we're talking about. I don't know how much you can generalize. In addition to all of the specifics of that particular case, there's broadly a distinction between workers being able to organize and advocate for their own interests, as opposed to abstract ethical principles for their consumers or users or for the good of the world or whatever. I have some thoughts on that. I have a different talk on that gets more into that topic that I'm happy to chat about offline.
Yeah, so I had a question about, so some of the companies also, not all of them, but some companies that work on this also are in multiple markets. For instance, like Google also is in a different market, like there are some. Do you see that having like its own effect in sort of like maybe pushing the monopoly power in a different direction. For instance, we saw some of that with like search, where they were able to push certain carriers to like have Chrome as their like default, like, so for instance, Gemini could be like the, for a lot of people that use like Google products, Gemini could be the default, and that could push it in a different direction in terms of like pushing the competition a little bit. I don't know if it makes it more competitive or makes it more anti-competitive, but I'm guessing different forces.
We haven't thought about that at all, but we'll be sure to appreciate that. Okay, so let me move on. So there are ways we think in which, in a sense, developers are forced to degrade their products. And one of those is safety guardrails. And I want to make very clear that I'm not against safety guardrails. That's not the point that I'm making. The point that I'm making is that adopting safety guardrails has the side effect of going beyond what the guardrail is supposed to do and leading to a kind of degradation. And this is basically inevitable. So why is that? There are two main reasons. One is when you adopt a guardrail, you want it to apply in certain contexts. When a guardrail is appropriate might depend on the intention of the user. A simple example, this is a hypothetical example, and an almost absurd one, just to illustrate the point. Imagine if companies were really invested in preventing use of their products for students cheating on homework. Right? But the problem is they have no way to know when a query is coming from someone who just wants to know, is curious about something, versus when it's an answer to a homework problem. And so it's as if to prevent cheating on homeworks, they made their models so useless that it's just gonna refuse to answer most factual questions because it might potentially be used for students cheating on homework. That seems like an absurd example, but I think there are many of these safety guardrails that have become normalized, which, while not so extreme, are kind of qualitatively in the same bucket. It prohibits a much broader circle of things than you actually consider to be harmful or inappropriate, simply because there's no way to distinguish between those different scenarios. And that's more or less the argument that we made in an essay a year ago. Safety is not a model property. The information available to the model when answering a question is far from adequate to be able to make nuanced safety determinations. So over and over again, you have these overbroad policies, and I'll give you some examples. And the other, for various reasons, we have a paper on interpretive ambiguity from several of you. Haven't read the paper in full, but my understanding is that even when you have specified a certain policy, ultimately it's the bot that's enforcing the policy, and if it is ambiguous, even for a human, but especially for a bot to understand and enforce that policy, it's going to result in both false positives and false negatives. In general, trying to do something innocuous with this product and being refused, either because the policy itself is too broad, or it's interpreted poorly, or there's simply a classification error by the model, all of those count as a kind of degradation. Again, I'm not saying safety is a bad thing, but it has a blast radius that is important to acknowledge. So this is an interesting one. When ChatGPT came out, one of the things I used it for right away is telling my kids stories. Like at the end of the day, when I've already told them 20 stories and I do not have it in me anymore to come up with another story, it's great. And even before ChatGPT released a voice interface, I liked this use case so much that I built a voice interface by connecting it to text-to-speech services, and I used it with my daughter. My son now, who is 3, really wants scary stories, and this is actually a behavior that's changed in the past year or so. It will now tell him a scary story. And it's hard to know if there is some official policy somewhere these are not fully made public, or if it's one of those cases of interpretive ambiguity. But the point is that I think all of us have these examples from our own everyday use cases for these tools where you're just trying to use it for something innocuous, but the machine god has decided that you're not actually allowed to use that because you might be a bad person who's using it for something bad. Yeah, lots of other examples of things that are way broader, I think, than they need to be. So the last one, companies are, for obvious reasons, with all the lawsuits going on, very afraid of being accused of copyright violations. So again, there seems to be an overbroad policy where it's like, so I often use it to go back and forth with the text of books, which is not a replacement for reading books. I often do this after I've already read the book. But I'm like, okay, find me the exact paragraph where it discusses this topic. Give me the quote, and it won't do it because it's so scared of quoting something because that can be construed as a copyright violation. And this is the text of the book that I put into it, that I scraped from my own purchased Kindle copy, right? So, you would think that there's nothing wrong with quoting a document that I myself uploaded, but again, the policy seems too broad. So the third one, this is an interesting one. So there was great work around the last election cycle from some of CITP's friends, Alondra Nelson, Julie Angwin, looking at the answers to election-related queries and showing that very often there was incorrect information, which can be obviously really problematic. And you can imagine that in some ideal universe, companies would have reacted to this by working with various local governments and extracting all the official election information in a machine-readable fashion, ensuring that that is properly input to the chatbot so that when you ask it an election query, it can be backed by correct information instead of some random Reddit post or whatever, and make sure that it's actually answering correctly. But in this and many other cases, the choice that companies have made is that they don't want the PR trouble of being blamed for election misinformation, so just no election content altogether, right? And in some cases, no politics content altogether. Or in some cases, no editing of faces, period, or no editing of any picture with a human face in it because you can imagine certain kinds of misuses that might happen. Yeah.
Have there been discrepancies like for the textual content between different languages? Have you explored that at all, where it's like they're enforcing this more in English than in other languages?
Oh yeah, there's tons of research on jailbreaking by exploiting differences in languages. Thank you. I appreciate that. So while it is true that there are many technical ways to get around these restrictions, in our model, at least, of what matters for the average user, we're kind of excluding that. We still count it as a degradation in quality. So there's a narrative that AI companies are in an arms race and they're, ignoring the safety community's recommendations. And there's, I think that point of view should be taken seriously. On the other hand, when you look at user experiences of these things, as they're reported on social media and subreddits, etc., that's not the picture that people seem to experience. And they experience these AI tools and their developers as being extremely risk-averse and preventing all kinds of use cases that users don't necessarily see the problem with. These two narratives are very much in tension with each other. So what is going on? One thing I want to propose is that maybe these narratives can both coexist. Maybe what is going on is that companies are often rushing products out and they're testing these things inadequately, and there's, of course, a lot of evidence of that. And so that kind of fits with the arms race narrative, because they want to be the first to market, cut costs, etc. On the other hand, there is a vibrant civil society and investigative journalists and researchers and advocates and others who are doing this kind of testing and identifying all of the dangerous things that might happen. And so when something is reported, companies are more than willing to adopt these crude and often overly broad policies that have the effect of degrading product quality for lots of people. And in many ways, both of these are instances of the same thing. Companies don't want to put a lot of effort into doing lots of rigorous testing and having nuanced policies that they can then enforce that only prohibits the actual bad things while allowing all of the innocuous uses that seem superficially similar to misuses. And perhaps over time, this is just a conjecture, it seems to be happening so far, but it's hard to know for sure. as the sector matures and there aren't that many first mover advantages anymore in getting the first million users or whatever and establishing mindshare, maybe we're seeing a shift more towards the risk-averse kind of behavior as opposed to the arms race kind of behavior. And there's a real risk here that these guardrails might really go overboard because of the phenomenon of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs. Getting a company to change its behavior on some safety-related issue is a big win for policymakers or safety advocates, et cetera. And they're able to claim that their advocacy has been successful when a company adopts a restrictive policy. However, it's hard to actually observe what kind of safety impact it's really having with real users because, again, we lack the measurement infrastructure for that. It could be that misusers are just switching to open weight models that lack those restrictions, and so in fact you've not achieved anything. Whereas the costs are diffuse across billions of users. There is an innocuous use case, let's say you wanted to edit faces, that you can no longer do, and it's not such a big problem for you that it's causing you to become part of a coordinated movement to exert pressure on companies to resist some of these overbroad safety guardrails. Okay, I think we're low on time, or do we usually stop at 50 minutes, right?
Yeah, we've changed our times.
Okay.
From 12:30 to 12:15, so we just have 15 minutes more.
15 minutes? Yeah. Okay, sounds good. Maybe I'll go for 5 more minutes and then we'll have some time for discussion. So another reason why companies might be degrading quality, might be in a sense forced to degrade quality from the perspective of some users. When you look at what those users on Reddit were complaining about with GPT-5, the main thing that they missed with the previous model, GPT-4o, was its sycophancy. The sycophancy that's been blamed, I think rightly so, for so many horrible things, including psychosis and cases of suicides, etc. Right? And this goes to the question of, am I talking about objective or subjective degradation? It is subjective. And if a lot of users, if they know what they're doing and there's something about the sycophancy that they like, it makes it a more valuable companion for them. We're not here to judge and say that we know better than they do about their own use of the chatbot and that it's problematic and that the model shouldn't have sycophantic behavior for anybody. And this puts companies in a very difficult position. The personalization paradox is that what makes these general purpose products better for some users might make them worse for others. So, but what is paradoxical about that? That's just a personalization problem. The paradox is that when you look at how technologists were thinking about this a couple of years ago, personalization was supposed to be the great advantage of these large language models. You were supposed to be able to personalize them endlessly because you can just tell it how you want it to behave and it will behave that way. It hasn't quite turned out to be so easy. There are lots of limitations of user skill and rationality. In an ideal world, you might imagine that ChatGPT would have a feature that controls the level of sycophancy, and the parent of the teen who had that experience would have known to use that feature and dial down the sycophancy, whereas some adult users who know what they're doing might be able to dial up the sycophancy, etc., and the problem would be solved. Guess what? That feature exists. It's in the settings screen, right? I mean, most of us have never really tried to use it. Even if personalization abilities exist, it does take a certain level of skill as well as rationality to know where you want, exactly how you want to personalize the behavior of your chatbot for your purposes. Okay, I'll stop in a minute. We also talk in the paper a little bit about geopolitics. I won't go into too much detail on this, how geopolitical pressures might result in governments promoting homegrown alternatives, which is good in many ways, but on the other hand, again, from this narrow perspective of the consumer experience, it might be that those competitors don't necessarily have the resources that the OpenAIs and Googles of the world have to put into improving their products. And on the other extreme, these more Western-focused companies might prioritize the experiences for users in Western wealthier markets which is something we've very much seen with social media, massively underinvesting in content moderation in developing countries, and that's been blamed, for instance, for various kinds of ethnic and sectarian violence that has been enabled by social media in many countries around the world, in ways that would be very hard to imagine in the US or Europe, because companies have lots of content moderators who are enforcing their policies, whereas it's not enforced nearly that well in markets that are less important to them. So that might happen with AI as well. This is the least developed part of the paper. I won't spend too much time on this, but would welcome your thoughts. So our view is that just knowing is half the battle, so we do think there needs to be much better benchmarking and measurement of these product qualities and not just the underlying model capabilities. We think regulators should be wiser about the different ways in which things can go wrong here. We should think about nudging or steering, to your question earlier. How can we incentivize companies to have certain business models over others? It's a little bit of an open-ended part of the paper, so I'll stop here and I welcome your comments. Thank you.
If you want to have a pet, you could have a dog or a cat. It's different personality. So maybe your chat bot also, you'll choose it. Many years ago, I think it was Richard Hamming said the purpose of computing is insight, not numbers. Or that might have been John Tukey, but he invented the bit. That's good enough. I said then, after that, the future of computing is companionship, not business calculation. It's a big, scary future to look at.
Yeah. Thanks. Appreciate that. Yeah.
I think this is like a very interesting kind of possibility result, and you clearly said if these kinds of things happen and these other kinds of things don't happen, then this thing can happen.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of moving parts, and so I'm wondering like how you would try to figure out if we're on the road to enshittification. Like how do you create some measurement system that tracks that, and then how does the analysis get updated as the world around all these assumptions are changing?
Yeah, the second one, how does the analysis get updated? I don't know. We just have to kind of rewrite the paper every year.
Beautiful.
But I mean, the measurement, it's one of those simple but not easy things. Part of the exercise here isn't figuring out what to measure, right? We can figure out what to measure, and then all that's needed is the funding.
And so you think a direct measurement of the end state is the best way to track if we're on the road to enshittification, not a tracking of some of the underlying assumptions about what it would take to get there. So
yeah, I mean both.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was really interested in the idea of like the subjective parts of this and like this idea of soft power and like the way that it's not like the computive like sort of metrics that we've been looking at, I think, traditionally with AI. To that point, and also to the point you were just making about like classifying it, do you think it is ever possible to classify it within like a global sense, or do you think it is going to come down to the regionality? I think also on that last like slide you were talking about globalization and sort of the Western influence and Western perspective it has. Do you think it would be something where we classify it for like people in America and people in other countries, or people in this industry and whatnot, unlike what they're doing right now with classification?
Sure. I think in the future it is quite possible that the experiences for users in different countries diverge greatly from each other. I don't think we're seeing too much of that right now, except of course, in China, if I understand correctly, for instance, most US chatbots are banned, and they would use local ones, and that of course makes sense. So there are big differences there, but with exceptions like that, I think the situation internationally is relatively homogeneous now, and one of the things we need to track is whether and how that starts changing.
Yeah, I've got two questions. One is on, I guess this penultimate question about like knowing when you're in your end state. you were very clear in this kind of temporal distinction you drew between what we're experiencing now and what you anticipate experiencing in the future, when you talked about market power and things like personalization and companionship. I guess the question I have is like, we're already seeing some examples of that with like character AI and replica and so forth. So like, what amount of, like what is the sufficient magnitude of these kind of criteria to indicate to you that we are in that future state versus the, some like below threshold state currently?
Yeah. I mean, I think we can quantify if we had enough money to do the right kinds of surveys, how many people have a kind of companion relationship with their chatbot for some suitable definition of what that means. And again, we don't have good data, but just based on the, the media reports we're seeing now, while the effects are pretty serious for some people, it still remains confined to a minority of individuals. I don't know, maybe just to pick a number. Let's say the number, if you did a survey now, is 10%, right, of people who are having relationships with chatbots that we can consider to constitute a very high switching cost from the perspective of the kinds of things I talked about. Yeah, so that would give us a lot more information than we have now. I would interpret that as it's starting to get serious, but it's still an emerging kind of exception to an otherwise competitive market. If that number were 50%, I would interpret that very differently.
Okay, and then on the second, I guess, more provocation is like, you seem to be framing this example in the New York Times article in this kind of like paradox of sycophancy debate. And I wonder, like, is that really the right framing? Because are there like domains where you would be able, I mean, you bring up this example, like the cheating example, and you say like, you're going to be discouraging all of these positive use cases if you just go overboard on there. But I guess the question I have is like, are there any domains where you think that trade-off is worth it to kind of put an X on things that should be output from these large language models? Because I think in that particular case, it wasn't like as much sycophantic as he was talking about when he was interacting with the model, that he had like this red mark on his neck as a result from an attempted suicide. And he asked it specifically if he should go and interact with his mom who was in the other room because he wanted somebody to notice. And like it basically said like cover it up and wear like a high collar shirt or something like that. Like that seems like kind of objectively a bad thing for these things to say, and I'm not sure that would be affected by a decrease in the sycophancy meter.
Sure, a couple of thoughts. I don't recall the details of how much sycophancy was blamed for that particular thing, but in general, there is very much, I think, a correlation between sycophancy and people developing unhealthy companionship that leads to, psychosis, in some cases, self-harm, etc. That's a general pattern. Maybe this was not the best example. So that's one thing. On your other point, yeah, as I was trying to say, my point is not that guardrails are bad. It's just that implementing guardrails in many cases, perhaps in the majority of cases, necessitates some policies that are broader than the thing that you actually consider to be harmful. And given that there are so many kinds of misuses, it kind of adds up, and it leads to these products being experienced as degraded in various ways.
I think about bad information that's out there. I think about that a lot because at another meeting at the university, basically you can lie publicly online and it's out there and nobody can stop you unless like somebody decides to sue you for defamation or whatever. So you have all these lies out there. I don't see how AI is going to be any different than social media in terms of just taking all of that information and delivering it. I really struggle with this. You can lie, and yet you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. There's a difference about that. So, AI can say, if you want to have a party outside the theater, just like, yell fire and everybody will come out and join your party. I'm like, I just don't see how you can have, effective control. What people need is an education, critical thinking or moral behavior or something, else to, more coming from the self than from the AI.
Yeah, I mean, those are all totally fair concerns. Our paper is deliberately narrow in scope. We're not really addressing those broader issues around the impact of AI on society, but only the narrower issue of how do consumers experience.
But to that point, I sort of feel like, isn't there a way to look at like what can be done and look at like, well, what should have we done about social media before we start looking? I think you sort of like implied that, and I wondered if you had thought about sort of the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which sort of we feel like shields social media companies, right? You can tell anything online, like any lies, and you're not liable as maybe other media companies who have to do a best effort to be factually correct. How that plays into this, and this is maybe something that can be done.
Yeah, thank you. I'll make a note of that.